my journey to diversity and the work that we're trying to do with diversity on board, and they also represent the journey of diversity and inclusion in different parts of the world and at different stages. So I want to start with Wafa Obaidat, who is the CEO and founder of Obai and Hill and the Women Power Summit. She's also become a very dear friend. And Wafa was actually the first person I called when I had the idea for diversity on board. Someone had told me that she was organizing the first Women Power Summit, which ended up becoming the largest Women Power Summit in the Middle East and North Africa. And she immediately wanted to plug in diversity on board into the summit. So rather than me tell you about the journey or the birth of diversity on board from my perspective, I thought it would be interesting to hear from Wafa on the journey that we've had and the way that she's seen it from her perspective.
Thank you so much, Lina, for such a wonderful introduction. Hello, ladies, and hello, everybody who decided to join us at 7 p.m. in the evening. I'm really excited to be chatting with you all today. I have a very short segment, but I hope it's a nice segue into everybody's session that's on this amazing panel. As Lina said, 3 years ago, so I wear two hats. I run a communications agency called Obai and Hill, and that's like my day job. And we decided to, as a team, create the Women Power Summit because we saw that Bahrain ranked quite low in terms of the gender equality report. And we just wanted to start a conversation about women and leadership roles and why aren't there more women on top, and what are the challenges going up the corporate ladder. And it was supposed to be a direct-free, marketing-free event where people could be vulnerable and talk about their failures and challenges. So when I connected with Lina, she was very specific about getting more women on board positions. And what I love about Lina's kind of approach to everything was research and fact-based, and all her research showed me and my team that more women on boards and more diversity on boards means the company becomes more successful, more revenue, more profit. So that's what Lina brought to the table, which I really appreciated. And what Lina has done in our first Women Power Summit, she moderated a session on women on boards. And what I loved about that session, and what I learned about that session, is we had a group of women on the panel, and the discussion was really honest, very intimate. And some of the women on stage didn't fit the right mold of what a board member would be on a prestigious institution. They were in their 30s, they were single, and they shared some really interesting stories. I remember one that really struck a chord with me, which was the story of how people, like a lot of people were happy for her when she got the board position. She's an entrepreneur and got an independent board seat. However, a lot of people questioned why she got that position. What is your wasta, or what did you do to get that role? And she shared this openly on stage and talked about how challenging it is to be a single woman and also have this seat on the table. So that was an interesting story. And she also ran an amazing workshop at the end of the first day, which again was about this time, 7 p.m. And there were about 80 people in that session. And I remember Lina called me and she said, they closed the light on us because they thought everybody left, but it was a packed workshop. So that, I think, proved that women wanted to know more about the subject matter specifically, and they wanted to learn from Lina herself. What I felt has happened in the last 3 years, I think Diversity on Boards launched as a beta version in the Women Power Summit, and we came on board as a founding partner. From an agency perspective, we supported her with the dragonfly logo that she was very passionate about, and also with the press releases and anything really that we could support her with as an ally. But what I saw happen, which I'm so incredibly proud of you, Lina, in the last year or so, is this community that you've built around diversity on boards and the rallying that you've got through strategic partners. And I'm really excited to see where this is going to go after this forum, because I think throughout all the conversations I've attended, most of the sessions in the last 2 days, this is a topic that needs to be, we need to keep talking about this and figure out different solutions to get more women into board positions. So I also, again, I mean, I don't know if anybody's been on the Diversity on Boards website. I hope you do check it out. I was so surprised and excited to see that there are now financial institutions putting placements and openings asking for female board members to apply. And also, you know, the list of ambassadors is up as well, which is really exciting. But the website has become a directory and a network to connect organizations with individuals, which has always been the solution that Lena wanted to provide. And there were a couple of events in Bahrain in the last few years where we had CEOs of organizations get on stage and say, we want to have more female board members, but we don't know where to find them. And one of them said, you know, we ask certain women and they just say, no, that's our biggest challenge, is even if we do try to reach out to certain women, we get rejected because they don't want to, like some of the reasons they mentioned on stage was they don't want the disruption, or they're busy with their work, or they're busy with their, you know, trying to find that work-life balance. So they kindly decline. And I think what this website and this platform is now going to be able to do is just provide as many options of women who are certified, women who are ready for the role, and women who are equipped, you know, as per industry to add value to all these institutions. So without further ado, I mean, good luck, Lena, and thank you again for giving me this this opportunity to speak. It's been wonderful to see that this was just a conversation 3 years ago, and now you've built a whole community and platform around this very subject that you're passionate about.
Thank you so much, Wafa. By the way, I know maybe time is relative with the pandemic, but it was 2 years ago. I know it feels a lot longer.
I was pregnant for the last 10 months, so it felt like 2 years.
Yeah, so one of the, I think, earliest conversations that we had as well, and I know if you need to leave, you know, you please feel free to step out.
I'm good.
But it was also, how do we find these women for diversity on board? And one of the first things that we did was asking male and female business leaders, government leaders, influencers in the region to nominate women, and then it would become a peer endorsed network. We would ask those women to nominate more women and help to amplify each other. And while I was doing research on different organizations, you know, across the world, I came across the Boardlist, and the Boardlist started, was it four years ago or 5 years ago?
Yeah, 5 years ago officially, yeah.
5 years ago, and today, tonight we have the CEO of the Boardlist, Shannon Gordon, and I started seeing the Boardlist as a sort of sister organization of what we were trying to do. And it's been really inspiring to see that progress over the last 5 years, because it gives me a sense of where we could go as a region. And I am really honored to have Shannon here tonight to share the Boardlist's journey, but also the implication that different policies and regulations have had on gender diversity on boards and diversity in general, especially, well, I'll let her share that, some of those policies and regulations.
Thank you, Lena. It's wonderful to be with you all. My morning, your evening. I can see the sunny day behind me here in San Francisco. It's wonderful also to hear what Lena is building, because, you know, I think the more of us in this journey together around the world, the more progress we'll make, and also, you know, grateful for the opportunity to learn from each other as we both go through a pretty similar path. So, you know, I prepared a couple of slides which I'll walk through, but, you know, generally just kind of add my comments, as Lena has said, about our journey in the hopes that that is helpful as you all begin yours. So let me just switch over to some slides. There we go. So the Boardlist, as Lena said, was founded in late 2015, and it was really born out of so I'm the CEO of the Boardlist, but not the founder, a woman named Sukhinder Singh Cassidy, who was most recently the president of StubHub, which is an event ticketing company here in the US, operating globally. but also had been a senior executive at Google and Amazon, as well as founding a few of her own businesses. She was frustrated by the dynamic that we had in Silicon Valley, this kind of culture, you know, we call it the bro culture, right? The very male-driven technology industry. And a lot of discussion about a desire to change that, but not a lot of action. And I think, you know, the excuse perhaps that was made was that we needed to wait for women to come up the pipeline, right, in STEM before the culture would really change. And Sukhinder felt that that was not acceptable, would take too long, and in fact wasn't actually a prerequisite at all. There were plenty of successful women in Silicon Valley that were already leaders in the field. And she challenged our venture capital community to add a woman to every board at a Series B company and beyond. Months went by, not a lot happened, and so Sukhinder, being Sukhinder, took the bull by the horns and decided to create a list. And that list was developed very much in the way that diversity on board is being developed, which is a peer referral network. Not only peer, right? Because what we did was went to board directors and asked them for women that they knew who were already serving on boards and should be serving on more. But also, very importantly, that talent that was coming up the ranks that was ready to serve on boards, but not yet getting tapped. You know, and really the reason for that, we felt, was that, you know, boards are kind of an interesting beast in that the vast majority of seats, particularly on the private company side, are filled via referral within the networks of other board directors. And we also know that that community, at least in the US, but globally as well, is not very diverse. You know, on the private company side, you know, most boards are made up of the investment community, which, you know, most of that money consolidated here in San Francisco and New York is largely male and largely white men. And so, you know, it's not at all to say that men don't know plenty of phenomenal women and willing to support their careers, you know, as they advance. In fact, that's effectively what the board list has been founded on. But, you know, as we all know, networks tend to be fairly homogeneous. We know and associate with people that look like and come from similar backgrounds than we do. And so, you know, this has kind of driven the lack of diversity in boards. And we wanted to break that cycle and really use technology to bring transparency and access to the phenomenal pipeline of female talent that we knew existed. So that initial list was 1,000 women that Sukhinder put together out of just asking the board directors in her network for their recommendations. And soon thereafter, we built a product. And so now, you know, have grown it using technology as opposed to where it started, which was an Excel spreadsheet. But I did want to just touch on a couple of the other things that have been going on here in the US. Rima, you may recognize some of this data is actually from the McKinsey report, which I respect deeply. The Women in the Workplace study that McKinsey does surfaces some outstanding information about the lack of diversity at the executive level. And I think part of this, the reason I just wanted to touch on this is that, of course, the pipeline of talent for boards comes from the executive ranks often. It's not always the case, but often. And, you know, what we've realized is not only do we have a phenomenal lack of diversity within the executive suite when we look at just with a gender lens, but also people of color. And in fact, it's much more dire when we factor in race. So there's a lot of work to be done. There is already a very strong pipeline of women and women of color, but there's more work to be done, not only at the board level, but also kind of coming up in the ranks as well. But I wanted to walk you all through this timeline of what's been going on in the US. It's been quite interesting. So the board list was founded in late 2015, and shortly thereafter, you know, we had the Me Too movement. And so certainly you know, we believe that we've done good work and have a great product, but we also are certainly beneficiaries of a much broader movement that has been going on. And so, you know, out of the Me Too movement, there was a tremendous focus on diversity in general, gender issues in the workplace here in the US and around the world. And around the same time, State Street Advisors, obviously a large institutional investor, asked the boards of all of their companies that they're invested in to add at least one woman to their board. BlackRock shortly followed, making the same statement. And then in 2018, the state of California passed a law that required that every publicly traded company in the state add at least one woman to their board by the end of 2020. So they were only given a 1-year window to do this. And I'll share with you a little bit in a minute what the results of that were, but that was a very big statement. I mean, California certainly is a very large economy in the US, larger than a lot of countries, making a statement like this, effectively putting a quota in place, really had kind of a halo effect. You know, we at the BoardList saw a 3-fold increase in the search volume, not only from public companies in California, from private companies as well, and those outside of the state. So that has been a real driver and helps, you know, focus attention on the issues of gender diversity. Many states followed suit, and then, you know, in 2020, the latest announcement is Goldman Sachs wouldn't take companies public through an IPO process without having a woman on the board. So that's sort of been the context in which we've been operating. And I think, you know, I'll share with you kind of how our metrics have evolved over time as a result of a lot of this. But just to touch back on that California legislation, there were only about 187 companies in the state that were compliant with the legislation at the beginning of the year. And almost as many companies, about 2/3 as many companies, added a woman to their board in 2019. And what you might know about board search is that, you know, these can take quite a while. So the fact that that many companies were able to add a woman to their board in just a 1-year period of time, I think speaks to the depth and quality of the pipeline of female talent. And now there are only 27 companies in the state that don't have any women on their boards. We often wonder, how are they getting away with that? But I also wanted to mention, as with regard to diversity, what's been an interesting trend that we've seen is really a change in the kind of new directors that we're seeing. So it's not just a focus on gender diversity, but there are other dynamics that actually have implications for diversity that are changing the game as well. So, you know, many of the new directors, at least in the S&P 500, are directors that are not CEOs or CFOs, right? So not in those top executive ranks. So there's some diversity from the pool of kind of functional background that's coming to the fore. There are, and similarly for minorities. And then about 30% of the incoming class for public company boards, so this is the S&P 500, are serving on their very first corporate board. So there is new talent, and that number is significantly higher for private companies. So there's significantly more new talent that is being infused into the boardroom, as opposed to what had been happening for decades before, which is kind of this leveraging the same talent across many boards, which is exciting to see. So all of that is helping to bring new and more diverse candidates to the boardroom. And as I said, you know, our journey has reflected that. So, you know, we now have 14,000 members on our platform. About 75% are board or C-suite. And so it's a very premium community. And on the flip side of it, about 1,700 companies have searched the board list. And, you know, just since January of this year, we've had a 3x increase in search volume month over month. So what I think, you know, has been fascinating about this is we have the additional dynamic that I haven't talked about here yet of the racial diversity discussion that is going on in this country and internationally as well. But since the death of George Floyd, the number of searches that have happened on the board list has just, you know, it's almost an overwhelming volume. So, you know, there's clearly a desire, I think, to get points of access into this more diverse pipeline of candidates, which is really exciting to see. So, you know, I think just kind of in sum, and then I will move on to Rima's comments, just to sort of summarize, I think what's been really helpful for us, one is having founded this organization in this referral process has been a really effective way for us not only to grow organically, you know, as a startup ourselves, not having to put a lot of capital into the business to be able to grow our community because we are reliant on the community itself to help us grow, has been enormously effective, not only in numbers, but also in the quality of candidates we're able to identify. We start with a very premium community, and therefore we usually identify candidates that are of very high quality and sought after for board roles. So that's been a really important learning. The second is that the context around us has mattered a lot. A lot has changed in the US and globally, but since we function largely in North America, it has been really important for us to have been born of the Me Too context, and then to have had so many of these elements change along the way. You know, we've been able to position ourselves as a thought leader on the topic of board diversity, and that again has provided us kind of this, you know, low-cost sort of awareness about the issue, and the board list as a tool and resource to be able to identify great talent. And then lastly, I think, you know, again, a strategy that Diversity on Board is employing is a strategic partnership strategy, where we have, you know, rather than seeing ourselves as a competitor to anybody else working in the space of trying to get women on boards, we've instead embraced that ecosystem and really positioned ourselves as the technology platform that helps expose and sort of elevate the membership of all the other organizations that are working in this space as well. The more kind of aggregated the talent is, the more likely companies are going to know where they can go to find the great talent. And so that's really our vision and what we're trying to build, and are quite open to these kinds of collaborations as a result. You know, and it's great for the organizations we partner with, because then their candidates are getting good exposure to board opportunities, which is exactly what everybody wants. So that has worked out very well as well. So just to share a few of the learnings as you all begin your journey, or are already on the path, but, you know, perhaps, you know, a few years earlier than us, it is a strategy that's worked quite well. And so I'm delighted to see it to come up in Bahrain. So thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, and thank you for being here. We already have questions coming in, and I have a question for you as well, which we'll come back to after we hear from Rima. Rima Assi is the senior partner at McKinsey Abu Dhabi, and I don't think that you can do any reading and research on diversity and inclusion without coming across some of McKinsey's studies. But what I really loved, aside from the research that McKinsey has done, is when I read an interview with Rima, who moved to Abu Dhabi 10 years ago. And I think you took the office from having 2 women to 200 women over the past 10 years. And it's really been this transformational journey. Diversity and inclusion is not the only thing that Rima does as a senior partner at a consulting firm. She has a very demanding schedule, but I just really admire that commitment to diversity. So to bring it back to the region, what are some of the best practices that we can implement to increase board diversity in the region?
Thank you, Lina, for this very nice and complimentary introduction. So I am very grateful for the opportunity to be with you tonight, and I look forward to this dialogue. This is a topic that is very important to my heart, and I think to all of us that are here. I was very inspired by the presentation that Shannon shared with us, and some of the amazing work going on. And we'll go through some of the facts in the MENA region. And I think there's a lot of efforts underway, and we're already seeing some results, but we still have such, the journey is still long, and we have so much to do. So I look forward to a very good dialogue today with everyone. So maybe I'll share some facts about the region, and then we'll open it to questions. So first, the notion that that equality is important, and equality across education, work, financing, legal rights is critical, isn't a new concept. I think what is important is to realize how much of an impact it has mainly on the economic growth. And this is actually an analysis we had done a couple of years ago to estimate the impact of parity on the economy. And our work had identified the 12 trillion impact globally from women, from parity, gender parity. For the region, that also meant an improvement by 10 to 11% of GDP. And 10 to 11% of GDP by 2025 is actually a big deal. We're talking about 600 billion value add created by that time. Now, when we talk about parity, there are 15 dimensions. And we look at equality at work, we look at physical security and autonomy, we look at legal and political power, as well as enabling opportunities. And when we look at how we've done at the region, more or less on equality at work, we have quite a high disparity. When we look at labor force participation, women labor force participation in this part of the world is one of the lowest in the world. What we try to, and as well as disparity around formal employment, leadership position, and the points you're talking about board representation. On physical security and autonomy, the numbers show that actually decreasing disparity, though we believe the pictures aren't fully clear. The legal and political power also show high level of inequality, yet we've seen a huge, significant improvement and momentum in that regard across MENA. And then on enabling opportunity, we actually see some opportunity and some positive momentum with relatively good equality in terms of access to financial inclusion and digital inclusion. Now, to unlock this the economic impact, we need to have equality across the board. Then what we also reflect on and say is that with the fourth industrial revolution, certain jobs are accelerating and made possible. And we believe we need to start thinking around where does equality and gender equality will make the biggest difference and will allow us to leapfrog faster. Because at the current pace at which we're going, it will take us 140 years to achieve parity in the region. So I'll take you through some of the points on the fourth industrial revolution. I'm not going to stay long. What we want to say is that while for many jobs, the fourth industrial revolution could mean automation and loss of jobs, for women, we believe this is going to be a significant opportunity, especially in the region. And this is due to, one, when we look at the digitization trends that are happening, they're enabling jobs that are actually jobs that are suitable for women, that our women would be, one, willing to take, but also highly skilled at. Two, when we look at the proliferation of digital platforms, they enable to match and to put together women that have skills and talent, but that are living in remote areas or that are not willing, not able to know about certain jobs. In the past, a lot of the business happened in Majlis. Now we have all the social platforms that are making those connections. We have LinkedIn and Upwork and so on and so forth. Then we have a rising trend of entrepreneurship. We have a significantly young population in MENA. Entrepreneurship is actually driving significant level of new opportunities, and we believe women are playing a more and more active role in the entrepreneurial space. And then finally, while increased automation, as I mentioned, will reduce certain jobs and will eliminate certain jobs, it will only affect 15% or so of women in the Middle East. However, we believe it will create significant new opportunities, even in sectors where historically women were not active, like, for example, oil and gas, etc. So in summary, we believe, actually, I'll skip this. We believe that our women in this part of the world will need to participate in this fourth industrial revolution. And for that, we believe we need to achieve parity in professional and technical jobs. And as we're looking at professional and technical jobs, we realize that actually we have 8 women versus 10 men worldwide in professional and technical jobs. In this part of the world, it's much worse. We have 6 women for 10 men in the Levant and 3 for 10 in the GCC. Now, what can accelerate that? And then we looked across those indicators, and 4 dimensions stood out as highly correlated with equality in professional and technical jobs. And they are education, digital inclusion, financial inclusion, and legal. When we look at education, there are interesting facts for us to keep in mind. First, when we look at our women enrollment in education, primary up to tertiary, it is on par with men. Actually, in some countries, we have more women graduating versus men, like 32% more women graduate in KSA versus men. We have up to 13% more women graduating in the UAE versus men. We have an even better news in the sense that our women tend to outperform in learning outcomes in most of the cases. However, in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, our women aren't sufficiently opting for STEM fields. We have only 2% of women in Egypt that study engineering versus 11% men. We have 1% that study IT. In the UAE, we have similarly 9% that study engineering versus more than double those are men, and so on and so forth. And the reason why so few women are opting for STEM degrees is also because of the limited role modeling and the limited role models they see in those fields. Then when we look at digital inclusion, which is also a critical component for women to be part of this fourth industrial revolution and to actually participate, we have 69 million women in this region that are still not using the internet. So for every 10 men that have access to internet, only 8 women do. And this is not at all the case in other markets in Asia and Europe. And the reality is we are seeing initiatives to boost digital inclusion, like the Injazat initiative to help 100,000 underprivileged women learn digital skills. We have a Google initiative, etc. But how fast is that, and how much more should we go? On financial inclusion, we have large variations across the region. In the GCC, actually, the access to financing is high. In Egypt, however, 73% of the female population, which is roughly 24 million individuals, are unbanked or underbanked. So the situation is very varied, and we believe this is a critical element for our women to be more active and participating in the financial system, whether traditionally or via the innovative solutions like microcredit, etc. Finally, when we talk about the legal framework, we see actually quite a lot of momentum in that space, and especially if we reflect on the past few years. However, there are still policies that do not support equal participation and promoting women in the workspace. For example, remuneration for work and equal pay, for example, paid parent leaves laws, etc., are still not present across the MENA, and could be, and these are only 2 examples. And also it is important to note, for example, that Jordan, Saudi, and UAE that are some of the top 10 countries across the world that have seen the largest improvement. So this is an area where we have a lot of hope, and there's still a lot to do, but we've seen significant momentum over the past few years. So this is all around how can we get women to start participating in the workplace and choose the studies and the path forward that can get them into the jobs of the future. However, this is not enough. And what we've also seen that is quite important in MENA, and the World Bank has been doing quite a lot of analysis about it recently, is the importance of retention of women in their careers. And I think this affects significantly, therefore, the funnel that you have as you start looking at women in C-suites and women in senior positions and women in boards. And as we look, and for us to understand this a bit more, we've conducted a survey across the UAE, Saudi, and Egypt to try to understand women's journey after they join a career. And a few insights we thought would be interesting for us to share with you. First, of course, there's a significant cultural and social pressure for women to leave their job as they start having children. And then when we look at it, the outcome of that is that 40% of management level women report to low levels of support from colleagues and peers when making personal choices about part-time, about maternity leaves, etc. A second driver is, of course, limited role models. When we asked our survey, almost half of the respondents reported having limited exposures to mentors and role models in their working environment. Third, the limited policies that boost diversity in the workplace. 44% of women claimed that this was one of the top dimension that could change significantly their experience and their ability to stay longer in an environment. Fourth is the unsupportive environment. Women don't feel included. HR policies often don't allow for more flexible working model nor paid parental leave. And then finally, of course, unconscious bias and microaggressions, which is a topic that is highly surveyed and highly documented, where our brains extrapolate and make biased interpolations and therefore lead us to sometimes misjudgment. So this type of bias explains why even at senior level, 64% of our respondents reported having to continuously prove their expertise, their credibility, and had to actually justify their recommendations or support their judgments. We've had significant amount of stories that are even linked to requirements for women to be at boards that are significantly more straining and requiring double checking their credibility, expertise, and competence far more than what they do for men. So now let's shift gears and discuss what can we do, and let's discuss the solution space. So we need to accelerate, and for that we believe there are three core areas of interventions that are important. One is we need to support and steer the education and the training, not pure education outcome. I think we've passed that. It's actually the guidance towards the competencies of the future, but also building digital competencies across any diplomas or degrees that our women tend to go for. Second is we need to think about how do we fix the structural foundation? What are the regulatory changes, the critical policies that need to be accelerated? What are the policies in the environment that we need to accelerate to provide a legal and regulatory environment that supports women? And then what are the changes to create a conducive environment, awareness, role modeling, and debiasing of employees and working environment. Finally, in addition to all of this, we've had a lot of discussions with even women colleagues, and the real change will also not only come with these 3 interventions. The real change will happen when also the women take ownership of their journey and focus on being proactive, driven. Do not underestimate the challenges they face, but before giving up, seek friends, seek sponsor, seek guidance, and still aim high, because the reality, it's only when we feel it's really tough, then we're really making a change. Thank you.
Thank you, Rima. We have a lot of questions coming in, and I have my own questions for both of you, but I'm gonna start with the participant questions, and then if we don't get to mine, I can always send them to you privately. So the first question we have for Shannon, do the 14,000 members of the board list include the C-suite and board members who are nominating the others, the potential board candidates, or is it only the board candidates?
It's both. That's our full community. So our community is made up of the companies searching for talent, the candidates, and those that recommend. We do find there is a very high overlap between board directors that recommend candidates and candidates themselves. So those that are looking for board roles, but also identifying women in their network that they want to elevate and expose to those opportunities. So, so I hope that answers the question.
And just also on that, how are women of color encouraged to be board members, and what is the success rate of moving candidates into board positions?
Yeah, so to answer the question on women of color, it's been quite interesting. Over the last couple of months, almost every board search that we have gotten has been a request for a woman of color. And so, you know, part of the challenge actually that we're currently working through right now is identifying some of kind of the legal hurdles of how we can handle race in addition to gender. The gender question has turned out to be quite a bit easier because we simply are a platform that only has women on it. So we don't have to, you know, be sort of filtering and sorting the database according to gender. But race kind of prevents that or poses an additional challenge in that there are limitations from a GDPR perspective on exactly what we can do there. So, you know, we're really excited in May when the unfortunate events with George Floyd occurred in the US. We went back and looked at how well we were doing on women of color, and we're really delighted to see, without having kind of metrics and policies in place about it, 91% of our candidate slates included at least one woman of color, and 58% of the total candidates we presented to companies were women of color. So we've always had a focus on it. It's always been, you know, something important to us. And now we're just elevating that and trying to figure out how we can do even better. And then the placement. So we have deliberately positioned ourselves to be kind of a discovery platform and a method for companies to find the candidates that they would like to speak to and get to know for open board roles at their companies. We are not a search firm in the sense that, you know, we do not work with companies we don't have a retained fee for search where we kind of guarantee that we're going to place somebody on the board. And so, you know, what we find is that has helped, actually, that works in favor of the candidates, for more candidates, because companies are able to come, they reach out to and interview several candidates and sort of use the platform for discovering that talent. And that's where our energy is focused. as opposed to kind of the mechanics of getting through the search process. All that said, we do track as many of the placements as we can. And in 2019, we had about a 250, 260 women on the platform join boards just in that year. So
amazing. People are also asking if we can share both of your presentations with the attendees. So I can connect with you later on that, but I think people were very interested in some of the statistics that you shared. And Rima, we have a question on how are we educating people on microaggression in companies in the MENA region, or even this unconscious bias?
Big and important topics, actually. Look, I think what I've seen is practices differ a lot. First, acknowledging that this exists is a first step, and this is not the case yet across the MENA region. We've had a lot of studies, and it's actually quite shocking. I will send across later to you. There's a test that anyone can do to see how much bias we each individually have. And the reality is, what we realize is that we all have significant amount of biases, and this is not wrong. It's just that the brain has to process so many information in a millisecond that this is the way we cope. The thing is, how do you become aware of those biases, and how do you avoid fully making a decision based on those in critical moments that affects one's careers? So what we're seeing is now slightly more in practice in certain companies. One, on recruiting. How do we ensure that we are actually giving as much chances to our men and women applicants? And that can be tracked, and training actually can be given to specifically interviewers of women candidates. Another critical moment is in performance reviews. What is the dialogue? What is the communication that is used? How is a woman described? There are very insightful analysis and research made how a male senior leader that shows empathy is highly acclaimed, but how a senior woman leader showing empathy is considered weak, and so on. So it is actually quite important. What we are doing internally is we are having behavioral psychologists observe our performance review discussions and play back to us whether there are biases in the discussion. And we are training our interviewer, we are training anybody that participates in a performance review discussion on actually being aware about those biases and learn to actually ask questions. Am I saying this? Would I have said this if that person was a man versus a woman? I think there's a lot that can be done there. This is a journey, in my sense, that has started much later than the typical policies, etc. But we still have a way to go.
So I want to come back to, actually, this is very similar to a question I was going to ask you, Shannon. So what strategies have you used to ensure that boards don't recycle the same group of women for board positions? So here, and I'm not sure if it's exactly the same in the US, but once a woman gets 1 or 2 board positions, all of a sudden she's literally on 10 or 12 different boards. So how do you help women who perhaps are competent but just haven't been given the chance to have that first board position?
Mm-hmm. This is a significant issue. Actually, the women that are serving on boards on the board list are serving on an average of 3, which there's certainly women that serve on 12 boards, but to be honest, I think if you're on a public or a private company, if it's a corporate board, in any sense, I think you'd be very hard pressed to be able to manage 10 or 12 and do an effective job at all of them. I mean, certainly there are super women and super men out there that can, but I actually, from the candidate perspective, would be really thoughtful about whether or not you can bring your best to that company before accepting that number of boards. And if you decide that you don't want to accept that number of boards, open the door and refer someone who perhaps hasn't gotten that opportunity. So that's sort of one suggestion on the candidate side. But the bigger issue, of course, is on the company side. And I think, you know, that is in part this kind of lack of access, which really is not a true lack of access, but instead perhaps a lack of intentionality of reaching out to the resources that do exist to get access to that pipeline of talent. And instead kind of defaulting to the names that many people know or are familiar with because those women have served on so many boards. The conversation we usually have, to be honest, I don't know that we have a perfect strategy, but very often when we get called to start a search for a board role, the classic criteria that someone will give us is we're looking for somebody who has served on a board before and who is either a CEO or a CFO. And so a lot of the conversation that we have is actually one of kind of coaching and really, actually, regardless of diversity, trying to help the board put in some best practices around really being thoughtful about the composition of the board. You know, there are tools that boards can use to really examine the skill set that's already represented on the board and match that up with the strategy, goals, and objectives for the company over the next, say, 3 to 5 years, and identify where they may have gaps between the board and the management team in really addressing those challenges or those opportunities. And once you have that conversation, the issues are actually, it becomes quite obvious that not always is the CEO or CFO candidate the best. They may be, of course, but not always. And so once you broaden the conversation to a bigger functional, a pool of candidates from a broader kind of functional background, oftentimes that opens the door for diversity. And then lastly, I would say we always put together candidate slates that include both women that have board experience and those that haven't. And what we find so often is that, you know, almost half, I can't remember if I mentioned earlier, just about half of the placements that we've seen through the board list have been women serving on their very first board. And I think that speaks to simply showing, exposing women and their incredible accomplishments to the companies looking for talent. Oftentimes the companies are quite surprised. Wow, I have never heard of this woman before. She's got an incredible background, and they have a great conversation with her, and it progresses from there. So some of it is work that we're doing, and some of it, I think, honestly, is just making sure that the right names, being thoughtful about putting the right relevant names in front of a board per their very specific situation, and things kind of unfold naturally.
We also have a question, I think, for both of you. In big multinationals, we're starting to see the creation of the Chief Diversity Officer. Do you see that as a step in the right direction?
Go ahead, Rima.
Shall I? Okay. So it is, of course, a great step in the right direction. This is not enough, though, right? And we've looked at advancing parity in the workplace, and some of our findings were around the topic of diversity and inclusion has to be top of mind for the leadership of that multinational corporation institution. It has to be one of the top topics on the agenda of the CEO. And as we say, whatever is not measured doesn't really improve. So we need to have right KPIs, or of saying how much do we want to achieve in terms of recruiting, how much do we want to achieve in terms of retention, how many women in C-suites we want to achieve in X years, knowing our population, our funnels, etc. And then we believe this needs to be complemented with the comprehensive programs around how do you attract women in your industry, how do you retain them, how do you support them, how do you enable that they have the right sponsors, because women have career discontinuities that are not the same as men. And they actually tend to find less naturally sponsors in a male-dominated environment. So how do you achieve that? How do you facilitate it? And then, of course, all the policies on maternity and leave and equal pay and etc. And then finally, in addition to all of this, is awareness on biases and microaggressions and working on that. So in our view, it is not one action. It's maybe a more comprehensive program that is needed. And this is a journey again. If I reflect year after year, what is the improvement? It's very disappointing. If you look back 5 years and 10 years, we realize we've done a lot.
And I think also just on the issue of sponsoring candidates, because this has come up, quite a few times. And in the earlier panel, someone was saying that it makes a huge difference when a female candidate has a male sponsor and a male mentor. It really helps to accelerate her path much faster than when she has a female, which makes it a bit tricky in our cultural context. So that's also something to consider. We have an interesting question here as well. How can we encourage board? Oh, sorry, Shannon, did you want to add to the question that was just
nothing to add.
So how can we encourage boards to be better with EQ, or are they meant to be entirely focused on financials and profits? And I would add to that as well, something else that kind of came up within the context of the pandemic is the importance now of boards looking at people within an organization. So, the people before profits, because if you are not keeping your employees healthy, then you have literally nothing. So just in the context of environment, social and governance on boards, and how that's going to be shifting with EQ or empathy, or the impact of health and safety, and that kind of factoring into board discussions.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. I've been doing a bit of research of late on the number of companies that have fallen victim to not doing this effectively. And by that I mean, broadening their scope of responsibility beyond the financial metrics. If you think about examples, again, US based, but if you think about the examples of Uber or WeWork, if you think about the examples of Boeing, these companies that have had front page, epically disastrous outcomes, you can trace some of that back to having a bit of a maniacal focus on purely financial outcomes, and letting the rest, culture, talent, retention, all of these elements, sort of or even, in Boeing's case, metrics of safety, or, elements that are not directly financial, but certainly have a direct impact on those outcomes, just leads to disastrous results. And so I think what we are seeing is slowly but surely, boards they're not the fastest paced change agents, but we have certainly seen a shift in companies recognizing that, as Rima pointed out in her presentation, this pace of change, right? The business world has changed so dramatically in the last 10, 15, 20 years that the more classic approach to governance is no longer suited for the world that we're living in. It is no longer acceptable to have this sort of limited view of the board's responsibility. And so I think that boards are coming up with a lot of different creative ways of doing it, but at a minimum, including some of those non-financial metrics and the monitoring of the health of the business, including the right perspectives. This comes back to diversity, right? Making sure that you have the right voices and perspective in the room to represent not only gender diversity, as we've been discussing today, not only racial diversity, but of functional background, people with different soft skills, right? So you want to have somebody on the board who has the ability to really sit down with some of the executive team and others and understand deeply what's going on with the culture of the company. These are all kind of becoming more and more important. And I think, frankly, not to a level of expertise that is particularly exceptional, but I think we're beginning the journey in boardrooms to really transform in that direction.
Absolutely. And we have, I know we're a little bit over time, just one more question for Shannon, and then I also want to ask Rima one more question. So we have a question for you from one of the participants. So thank you for your platform. Are there benefits in the US when hiring women of color, LGBT? And do you think women tend to be less open to recommending and referring other women because they're more competitive?
Such a good question. I was personally quite curious about this when I joined the board list. And on top of it, was very delighted to see how many men have been engaged on the board list. So to take this from a slightly different angle first, it has been really heartening to me to see how many men, because, you know, at the time when I joined, we were just coming off the heels of the Me Too movement. And, you know, I think people were really discouraged, disillusioned by, you know, the bad behavior that we saw in the top ranks at companies. But what really was really heartening for me was to see how many men, in fact, were engaged in promoting women within their own network. So that was wonderful. But likewise, it's also been wonderful to see how many women, as I mentioned, I think a little bit earlier, there are many women who have board experience, join the board list because they're interested in adding additional boards to their portfolio of work. They are some of our most active recommenders of other women in their network. So not only are they interested in, you know, positive outcomes for themselves, the additional opportunity, but are willing to bring other women along in their journey. And so in the aggregate, I think that's largely the story that I think we all recognize, especially as women, having needed, I think, because, you know, of having sort of more limited networks often coming up in our career, recognizing the importance of them and being willing to give back once, you know, we reach certain levels in our career. And that's been really wonderful to see too. I don't mean to paint a completely Pollyanna picture. Of course, there is a little bit of the dynamic that you described, but in aggregate, we see a very active community interested in elevating others that are sort of coming up through the ranks.
It's very encouraging to hear. And then just to end with one final question, Rima, how do you think the pandemic and the different skill sets that are going to be needed in the boardroom will impact boardroom diversity in this part of the world? Are you starting to see a shift at all with some of your clients, or, you know, are you noticing any changes?
I am not noticing significant changes. There have been some announcements coincidentally that happened last week. And funnily enough, the CEO of a large company sent me the new board announcement, and the vice chairwoman was a woman. And so, of course, there are changes. Now, how is COVID affecting that? In reality, I think I echo exactly what Shannon has been saying, and you've mentioned it. I think there is more and more realization that companies will have to navigate uncertainty on a continuous basis. That having forums where the different point of views are raised is very important. And therefore, in some ways, having diversity I would hope, would become even more acclaimed and needed. So we haven't seen a significant shift. I'm hoping we will see more of that. However, what also COVID has highlighted is a lot of changes in the way we work, a lot of ability to have remote working. And I'm hoping that also will make it easier to tap a wider network of women that are capable and that can support and be part of boards more widely in this part of the world as well.
I hope you're right. I just want to acknowledge the time. Rima, Shannon, thank you so much for being here. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation with both of you. Thank you to all the engaging questions we've had as well from the attendees. And there's definitely been a lot of conversation, so that's been good to see.
Thank you for having me.
Lina.